All right. Good evening. So it's my privilege to talk to you all a little bit and just share the life of John Gibson Paton or Peyton. The pronunciation depends on who you ask. If you ask Pastor Josh, it's Paton, since that's what he named his child. But if you ask other people, and I think it's the majority, I think you'll hear Peyton instead. So I might use them interchangeably, and as long as Pastor Josh doesn't hear me say Peyton, I think we'll be okay. But he was born in 1824 in Scotland, in the southern region, in a area I will not attempt to pronounce. Something along the lines of Dumfriesshire, something like that, but pronunciation was escaping me. He was one of 11 children, so big family. His home was marked by an amazing father. He cultivated a home where the Word of God was treasured, prayer was highly valued, Sundays were for the 4-mile walk to church and back, where he engaged his family and particularly the children in conversation about the sermon, and that really grew a home that loved the Lord and a desire for Him. If you read his biography, which I'll refer to a lot, he has a really great autobiography. It is a big boy of a book. It is about yay thick, and it is fairly comprehensive. I would encourage you all to read it. You can get one from Jeremy. He's got a copy if you want to borrow it out of the Jeremy Thompson Library. It is a really wonderful read. And if you also have the opportunity, Pastor Josh actually has an original printing from, I believe, the late 1800s or early 1900s, intact copy of that autobiography, signed by someone who took that autobiography to the region that we'll discuss in a little bit. After Patton's mission had ended. Really neat little piece of history here in our church building. But for a non-historical version, you can ask Jeremy for a copy. It really is a great read. So his home was a place where the love of the Lord was valued, and he felt the call to the ministry around age 12, and so he pursued that. He did work for his dad and helped him, learned part of that trade, but he really was aimed for the ministry from a pretty early age, so he didn't go into carpentry or, I believe he was making his dad was making components for some of the, one of the early machines, the name of which escapes me, but it was early manufacturing. And so he goes and he gets his schooling. He started as a Sunday school assistant teacher in the city of Glasgow, Scotland. So these would have been evening classes where young people would come. And when he arrived, he tells the story where he shows up and one of the teachers pretty much hands him a rod and says, "You're going to want to use this or you'll never get anything done." So pretty much setting the stage for a very unruly class, where it's going to be hard to teach, hard to get any momentum. But as he says in the biography, he resolved to really not want to use it. He really wanted to persuade them to behave accordingly. And after only one or two major disciplinary moments, he got the class in line and began to see some really wonderful growth. And he did that through force of personality. And those classes grew. He did a wonderful job. His ministry grew. And in fact, it even earned itself a name called the Green Street Mission. And you know you're effective, for better or worse in Christian ministry, when certain people begin to hate you for your ministry. So it developed into such a way where he was influencing so many people. And for context, he was a total abstainer of alcohol. He would have nothing to do with it in his teaching and pastoring. He did the same. So the barkeepers of Glasgow actually hated him quite passionately. That's how forceful. Can you imagine restaurant owners in Greenville hating a local minister because of his preaching? It was quite something. He was also a very staunch Protestant. He grew up Presbyterian. So again, for context, we're talking about a Presbyterian minister and missionary. And the Roman Catholics ended up hating his guts as well, to the degree where he was assaulted on multiple occasions. He says that rocks would be thrown at him, pots of boiling water dumped out of windows aimed at him. I mean, they really did not like him. And again, not for him being a heretic or anything, but he was just having such an influence in the right ways that the right kind of people were very upset with him and wanted him to stop. And indeed, his superiors encouraged him, hey, you're being attacked. Maybe you take a break, take a vacation, head out of town for a little bit, maybe let the heat die down. And he refused. And he said this, quote, "Let them see that bullying makes you afraid, and they will brutally and cruelly misuse you. But defy them fearlessly or take them by the nose, and they will crouch like whelps beneath your feet. So that was a no on the leaving. So he stayed. The mission continued and was very successful. So that's about 10 years. So he enters this ministry at age 23. He's doing this for about 10 years. Now he's 33. And at this time, he hears tell of the missionary needs in a place called the New Hebrides Islands. Those islands are in what I believe we would call the South Pacific. If you're looking at a globe and you're looking at Australia, directly east by a couple hundred miles in the ocean. Now, if you search New Hebrides in Google, you will not find that anymore. It is now called the Republic of Vanuatu. If you're looking on Google at some point for this. And those New Hebrides island chains had multiple individual islands, each with their own name and their own peoples. But he feels called to this ministry, and he is encouraged in his spirit to go, and he has a burning desire to help these people with the gospel. The reason why there is a vacancy and a call, as you may have heard, can't remember if Pastor Josh has said this recently, but the last missionaries that were sent to these islands were killed and eaten. The islands were populated with cannibals. So a fairly intense situation. That's why there is a vacancy in the missionary need, because the last ones met that end. So he declares in for the mission. He puts in his application to go, and it's actually met with resistance. Not because he's not qualified or capable, or that he would be a good candidate, but they don't want him to give up his successful evangelism and teaching in Glasgow. They don't want him to leave. It'd be like us not wanting a local minister to go overseas because he's doing such a good job here, which we can sympathize with. We're going to lose one of our residents, Blake, sooner or later to the IMB, and I'll be very sad to see him go because I love having him here. He's been a huge blessing to me personally and as part of our young professionals class. But at the same time, it's his calling to go, and we're not going to stand in the way of that. So we can sympathize with that, but they stood in his way. And this is another very famous quote from his autobiography. The objection comes from one of the church ministers, and he says, "The cannibals! You'll be eaten by the cannibals!" And his response, again, is just perfect. He said, "Mr. Dixon, you are advanced in years now, and your own prospect is soon to be laid in the grave, there to be eaten by worms. I confess to you that if I can but live and die serving and honoring the Lord Jesus, it will make no difference to me whether I am eaten by cannibals or eaten by worms. And in the great day, my resurrection body will arise as fair as yours in the likeness of our risen Redeemer." That is what I would call an argument ender. I don't know how you come back, what your comeback is to that. So he's approved to go on the mission, and he's headed out for the New Hebrides. He does take a wife shortly before this by the name of Mary Ann Robson. So they get ready to be sent out, replacing Mr. John Williams, who was attacked and killed and eaten pretty much immediately. In this particular instance, I don't know if it's in his journal or if it's in another work, but basically he writes that Mr. Williams writes that he was about to land on this island, and today will be a day in history. And he lands, he gets off the boat, and is almost immediately attacked, killed, and eaten, almost instantaneously from when he landed. So that's the context that Paton and his wife are walking into. They were commissioned in March of 1858, set sail, and the journey there took 4.5 months. So sailing from the United Kingdom to the New Hebrides, 4.5 months. They picked the island Tanna as their point of destination. There are several others, like I said, in that island chain, but Tanna was known to be the darkest and the most intense, and so that's where they picked. They got a house there, and by got a house, I mean, of course, they had to build one. So they arrived, they pick a spot they thought would be good, and they built a house there. Unfortunately, the place that they picked just off the beach ended up being marsh swampland, which, if you're from the south, you know what happens in marshes. That's where the mosquitoes live, and that's where the malaria lives. So unfortunately, their lack of knowledge or understanding of that proved to be a problem. 4 months after they landed, Mary Ann Robson, Paton's wife, gave birth to their first child, which is a boy. Unfortunately, they would both be dead in 3 weeks. So they land. 4 months later, she gives birth, and 3 weeks after that, they both pass. The child, I believe, took fever, and then Mary Ann took fever after that. presumably malaria. If you read his autobiography, you'll read the word fever about 1,000 times, because they didn't quite figure out the whole why this was happening until sometime later, and he moves locations, and then he stops getting sick all the time. It's amazing how that works out. Unfortunately, he didn't realize that, and so the word fever must appear in that book 1,000 times. It was sad to hear. It's like, oh man, because I'm from Charleston, and so I'm like, well, yeah, you in lowlands where the water pools, you're not going to have a good time with that. So obviously, after that tragedy, he was encouraged. After he wrote to the Spears, he was encouraged, like, hey, you want to go home for a bit? I mean, that's awful. You're newly married, first child. You just got here. That's terrible. But he said he would stay. In fact, he was actually, and he records this in his book, as he's got malaria or a fever himself as he's trying to bury his wife and child. I mean, can you imagine being like delirious with fever trying to do that and refusing to leave? I mean, that would be hard for me. I'd be like, all right, I'll regroup and come back again. But he stayed. And in that, the work of evangelizing the natives was difficult, to put it mildly. I mean, it sounds obvious, like, well, they're cannibals. Of course, they'd be difficult to evangelize. But I don't think that really gives it justice. It would be... he was engaging a society that every value that we hold dear would be turned on its head. So we value honesty and integrity. They would lie and deceive you just as easy as breathing. We seek to never murder or kill people if we can help it. They went to violence at the drop of a hat. They would honor life. They didn't care at all. I mean, it was pretty terrible. Basically, the exact opposite of everything we would hold dear. And trying to interact meaningfully with a society like that is challenging. So he was trying to introduce the worship of God. Obviously, they had their own gods. They were worshiping like the volcano god, or the god of this, that, and the other. So he's trying to introduce worship to Jehovah, which is the term that they were just using, just Jehovah. I know we use that too sometimes, maybe not as common, but as he always put it, introducing Jehovah worship. So here's some examples of the society he was trying to interact with. When he was eventually trying to move and get out of that area, he bought the same property 3 times because of their deceptive practices of who actually owned the land and who he needed to buy it from. So can you imagine buying your house or land 3 times over? Put me in a bit of a tizzy. They would frequently murder the widows of deceased men, just so the women could go serve the men in the afterlife. That was why they needed to die. Not for out of grief, but because, well, he's going to need a servant in the afterlife, so we'll send the wife, which is awful. You've probably heard Pastor Josh tell the story of him being chased through the jungle by the natives, and he had to climb a tree. Have y'all heard that one? No, you haven't heard that one. So this was a good ways into his mission, and things had come to a bit of a boiling point with one particular tribe and its chieftain. There's multiple tribes on an island, all competing for territory and resources. And one of them was particularly angry and was breathing murder and threats against Paton. And so he ended up fleeing in the jungle in the night, running through the trees. He ends up climbing a tree and huddling at the top of it, and he's literally watching and hearing this tribe just coming for him, looking for him to kill him. He would occasionally hear the guns going off, and they've got their war clubs and their axes and whatever else they could get their hands on. And he spends the night clinging to the top of a tree, waiting to find out if he's going to die or not. And I don't have the quote here because it is long, but it basically, to summarize, he said he never felt closest to his Lord than in that night, clinging to the tree. And he said, and I told all my heart to Jesus. And I was like, yep, I'd be telling my heart to Jesus too. If I'm literally, it almost sounds like a cartoon. Just the insanity of it. A full-grown man hiding in the top of the tree, waiting for the natives to pass and hopefully not kill him. But really, in reading the book, it's almost like the book of Judges to a certain extent. The cyclical nature of it is, Israel has a good situation, they sin, they have issues, and then they have to repent, and the cycle resets. The cycle with Paton was that he would engage a tribe, there'd be some initial hostility, but he would make some progress, then they get angry and they start saying they're going to murder him again, and there's some kind of incident like the one I just described, and then he let things cool down, and then the cycle begins anew. That was kind of the pattern that he went through, but he was faithful and diligent. And so that was the main story that's kind of representative of the situations he was dealing with. One factor that I did not anticipate when I was reading the book is that the European traders who would visit the islands made things so much worse. You would think that ship bringing resources or maybe some help that'd be good. They actually made things way worse because a lot of them were definitely not Christians. And they would abuse the natives, sometimes would kill them, or they would be deceptive to the natives, which of course reinforced their own desire to be equally cruel or abusive back. And to them, at that point, all the white people were the same. So they would end up viewing Paton with the same suspicion that they viewed those traders who would use and abuse them too. And that made his life a lot harder. And so that went on for 3 years. And to put it bluntly, there was not a lot to show for it at that time. He did have some people who would help him maybe work on translation or working on language so he could speak or get a written language in place for them. But there was no mass conversions. There's no church built, nothing of that nature at that time. And during this time, he's about to leave for a period of time. But before that happened, I got to bring up an incident because it'll become relevant in a minute. During this time, a ship called Curacao was sent by the Queen to investigate what had happened to the previous missionaries, the ones who were killed and eaten. And so the ship comes and they do their investigation. They find out what happened. And basically the Queen sends back, well, give them an example of what will happen if they mistreat any of my subjects again. And what they ended up doing was they moved the natives out of a couple of the villages so that there was no one there, and then they shelled the villages to say, you kill any more of my subjects, and the next time you'll be in the village when we blow it up, basically. But they did not do that the first time. They moved the people away. So Paton leaves to go fundraise. He leaves after 3 years. He goes to Australia because he believes that they need a dedicated Christian mission ship so that supplies can be brought in, more missionaries can be brought in. He's not dependent on the merchants who end up making things worse. So that would be a help to him as well. And if he needed to leave for safety reasons, there would be a ship available at relatively quick speeds. So he goes to Australia to fundraise, and he speaks to churches or related ministries to raise funds for that missionary ship. While he's there, the story gets out about the whole Curacao shelling the villages. Now, newspapers have not changed all that much in the last 150 years. So instead of reporting exactly what happened, they say, the missionaries basically called in an airstrike on the villages, and there's burning and bodies everywhere, and these Christians called in this to pay back these villagers for killing their missionaries, and blood and guts everywhere, and all these headlines get printed, which of course means that the churches who are reading these newspapers are not about to give Paton any more money because they think he's part of a group that has resulted in the deaths of all these natives under these cruel circumstances, which is of course not true. But that's the story, and that's what they were all running with. So Paton has to end up spending time defending himself and his mission to the churches, as well as trying to raise money from them, which you can imagine is not an enjoyable task to try and say, no, I promise I did not burn and slaughter the natives while I was trying to preach the gospel to them. Like, you would think that conversation would not need to be had, but unfortunately it did. He was successful ultimately. He did get a retraction out of some of the major outlets, but damage is done when the story gets out, and so that was a big setback for the time being. But in the end, he does end up raising enough money to get one ship that was sufficiently crewed going forward. So that he got that one thing done. Unfortunately, he had to spend a lot of time fighting lies in order to get it. Other interesting thing about his life that I also did not see coming, when he was in Australia, he discovered that the settlers there, the European population there, had completely abandoned and given up on trying to evangelize the Aboriginal people. They just did not make any effort. And Paton's, it's like, well, why are we not trying to reach them? It's like, well, they're too dumb for religion. We've never seen them do anything religious in years and years and years, and so we don't think they even have the intellectual capacity for religion. Which Paton, having just spent 3 years among what we would bluntly call savagery. I mean, he spent 3 years. He's like, no. They have gods. We just have to actually figure out what they are and see what their actual worship practices are. And it almost reads like a detective novel where he's having to go around and figure out why are none of our people observing whatever these worship practices are? Why don't we see this? What's going on? He has to bring a lawyer with him to get statements from the Aboriginal people to take them back to the churches and then confirm. But basically, what had happened was early in the settlement, the Europeans had mocked and I think destroyed some of the gods and idols of the Aboriginal people, and they basically went into hiding in that respect. So they didn't do any outward expressions around the European people because for fear of either mockery or destruction. And so over time that led to the Europeans saying, oh, well, they don't even have the ability or knowledge to worship anything. And so untold thousands, maybe millions of people lost because of that kind of arrogance. And so Paton was, of course, deeply upset by this, and he did his best to change the minds of the Australian church, say, no, you just have to do some digging. These people can and do worship, and they need evangelizing just like any other people group. And so, again, not where I thought when he said he was going to Australia to fundraise. I did not think that was the turn it was going to take.
About what year was that?
So that would have been 1862. That's when he left for Australia. And he spent 3 years doing that. 4 years total doing the fundraising. He did also go back to the UK for a little bit of that trip, but a good chunk of that was his time in Australia. So 1862, after having spent 3 years on Tanna, sails to Australia in 1862, fundraises for 4 years, and he gets his ship. At that time, he then goes back to the New Hebrides. This time he is remarried, and this time, instead of returning to Tanna, he returns to a nearby island called Aniwa. It may have a different name now, but he spent 15 years there. So this is actually where the bulk of his time is spent, the island of Aniwa. The dangers were similar on Aniwa. It was not all that different. Sickness, possible murder, all those things remained. And yet, the people of Aniwa ended up being far more responsive. Inside of a year, he had 120 people attending Sunday worship. Very, very strong difference. It's fascinating to hear that, how quickly the mission grew there as opposed to Tanna. So they ended up being able to build a church, able to build a school, orphanages, things of that nature. So he spends 15 years doing that, and that kind of continues, and it grows and it builds. And then after that 15-year period, his sons are there now. They start taking on mission responsibility there. He then spends the last 17 years of his life going back and forth fundraising to continue to build up the mission. So he keeps on doing that for the last 17 years of his life. And he has multiple sons. I believe he had 4 or 5 sons, and most of them were staying on the island and continuing the missionary work there. And he passed in 1906. And he finished his autobiography, and then it went to print, and it's been in our hands ever since. And so the legacy of that is kind of wanted to spend a quick minute on. And just for full disclosure, I'm getting this information from a ministry video that I was able to watch from a Presbyterian denomination, which makes sense because he was Presbyterian, and so they hold him in very high regard. And one of their missionaries went to what's now called the Republic of Vanuatu, and he was visiting those islands. And there are hundreds of churches on those islands now, where there's, Paton worked 3 years and not get one. Now there's hundreds of churches there with the believers there. Some of them can trace their, as like Timothy, his grandmother, the faith of his grandmother and all that stuff, they can trace their lineage back to some of those early converts of Paton. Including one who is the there's 8 great-grandson of the village chieftain who led that raid to murder Paton that night he was climbing in the tree. His great-great-great-great-great-great-grandson is a believer in Christ, which is a pretty amazing legacy to have. Your ancestor wanted to murder you, and now this one here trusts in the Lord for his salvation. They're a pretty amazing legacy. So yeah, that was the life of John Gibson Paton. is a great read and very encouraging and challenging for sure, in a lot of different ways. For me, the number one thing, and this is possibly because of the phase that I'm in that we were talking about a few minutes ago, hearing his description of his dad will probably bring you to tears. Whether you had a good dad, a bad dad, or a great dad, reading about the way that his father raised them and spoke of them, and the way that Patton felt about his dad, it was like 11 o'clock at night, and Amanda's like, Mark, why are you crying? I'm like, because this is the best dad ever. It's just really beautiful tribute to his dad. And I'll paraphrase. When he was leaving to go into Glasgow, and he knew he wasn't going to see his family, his mom and dad, possibly forever, because it's a long ways away. Basically, his dad walks him to the station, and he runs up a dike, and he's trying to get one last look of his dad. And it turns out his dad has also climbed on the opposite side, and they're both looking for each other on the other side. And he basically says, that image of my father rose before my eyes time after time during all the temptations of youth, or when things were hard. He said, I would never want to do anything that would ever tarnish the memory of such a beloved father. And he says it way better than that. So read it, if only just for that, because I just get emotional now talking about it. But the way his father raised him and the love and respect that he had for him is probably the one thing that actually hit me the hardest. Just because I'm in that phase right now, wanting to raise a son that loves the Lord. But also the things that he endured for the name of Christ on Tana particularly. I mean, psychologically, it's hard to even think about like living your life for 3 straight years where someone's probably going to threaten to murder you every day. Like that's a tough thing to bear mentally. That for me, that was like, how do you live through that? Well, the only answer is through Christ, because by man you can't. No one's going to bear up under that weight or fear. So he was a great man indeed.